A police dog barked once at a park bench, just one single bark. And what officers discovered hidden underneath would stun them to their core and solve a case that had haunted an entire community for 4 long months. This isn't a story about a lucky break. This is a story about a mother's worst nightmare finally ending. This is a story about a 6-year-old girl who deserved to come home. And this is a story about the moment everything changed. Stay with us. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late September when Detective Sarah Chen decided to take Max out for their usual patrol at Riverside Park. Nothing about that day felt different. The sun was warm on her shoulders, that perfect autumn warmth that comes just before the cold sets in for good. The sky was a brilliant blue, dotted with white clouds that drifted lazily overhead. A few joggers passed by in their athletic gear, earbuds in, lost in their own worlds. Some kids played on the grass near the basketball courts, their laughter echoing across the park. It was the kind of day that feels like every other day. Ordinary, forgettable, unremarkable. The kind of day where nothing bad is supposed to happen. Sarah had been a detective for 12 years. 12 years of crime scenes and interrogations and late nights staring at case files until the words blurred together. 12 years of seeing the worst that people could do to each other. 12 years of carrying the weight of unsolved cases like stones in her chest. Max had been her K-9 partner for 5. 5 years of trust built on countless patrols, countless alerts, countless moments where his nose had led them to the truth that human eyes couldn't see. 5 years of partnership that had become deeper than most human friendships. Together, they'd walked this park hundreds of times. They knew every tree, every bench, every corner. They knew where the drug dealers liked to hide their stashes. They knew which homeless encampments needed extra attention. They knew the rhythm of Riverside Park like they knew the rhythm of their own hearts. It was routine, comfortable, safe. The kind of patrol that you could do on autopilot, where your body goes through the motions while your mind wanders to other things. Max was a German shepherd with a coat the color of burnt caramel and eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes had seen things that would haunt most creatures for life. But Max was a professional. He was trained to detect the scent of human remains, a skill that had saved lives before, a skill that had brought closure to families who thought they'd never find their loved ones. But on most days, on most walks, he was just a dog enjoying the afternoon with his handler. Just a partner going through the motions. Sarah's mind was somewhere else that day. She was thinking about the case files piling up on her desk, back at the station. Stacks of manila folders representing unsolved mysteries and frustrated families. She was thinking about the budget cuts that meant fewer officers and longer hours. The impossible task of doing more with less. She was thinking about the coffee she'd skipped that morning because she'd overslept after working until 2 in the morning on a case that had gone nowhere. She was thinking about how tired she was. She wasn't paying attention. And then Max stopped. It wasn't a gradual slowdown. It wasn't a casual pause to sniff at a tree or investigate an interesting smell. It wasn't the kind of stop that happens when a dog catches the scent of a squirrel or a rabbit. Max's entire body went rigid, his muscles locked, his ears perked forward, standing straight up. His tail, which had been wagging lazily just moments before, went completely still. His nose began working frantically, pulling in air in quick, sharp bursts. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. Processing information at a speed that human senses couldn't even comprehend. Sarah felt the leash tighten in her hand. "Max?" she said, suddenly aware that something had shifted, that the routine patrol had just become something else entirely. "What is it, boy?" Max's focus was locked on something near a weathered green park bench about 30 feet ahead. The bench was old, worn by years of sun and rain, and the weight of countless people sitting on it, sharing moments of their lives. It sat in a slightly secluded area, surrounded by overgrown shrubs and low-hanging branches that had grown wild and untended. Not many people sat there. It was too far from the main path, too isolated, too easy to overlook. It was the kind of place where things could be hidden. Max pulled forward, his entire body trembling with intensity. Not the trembling of a dog excited to play. This was something deeper. This was instinct. This was purpose. Sarah's instincts kicked in. In 12 years as a detective and 5 years working with Max, she'd learned to trust her partner's reactions with her life. She'd seen him alert on cases that seemed impossible, on leads that had gone cold months ago. She'd watched him find things that should have stayed hidden, things that people desperately wanted to keep buried. This was different. This was urgent. This was the kind of alert that meant something terrible had been found. Max reached the bench and his nose went down, working the ground beneath it with obsessive precision. His body was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into action. Every muscle was tense. Every movement was deliberate and focused. His entire being was concentrated on this one spot. And then he barked. Not a playful bark, not a greeting, not a demand for a treat or a toy or attention. This was the alert bark, the work bark, the bark that meant he'd found something, the bark that meant his training had activated and he was telling his handler that they needed to pay attention right now. One sharp, authoritative bark that cut through the afternoon air and changed everything. The joggers stopped. The kids playing basketball paused. The peaceful afternoon suddenly felt fragile, like something had just cracked beneath the surface. Sarah's heart began to race. The adrenaline hit her system like a jolt of electricity. She pulled out her radio with trembling fingers, her voice steady even as her hands shook. "Dispatch, this is Detective Chen. I need backup at Riverside Park, near the east entrance. K9 has made a discovery." The words were professional. Her training took over. But inside, Sarah knew something terrible had just been found. Something that had been hidden. Something that someone had tried very hard to keep secret. She looked down at Max, at the intensity in his eyes, at the way he was staring at that spot beneath the bench. In 12 years, Sarah had learned that Max was never wrong. And what Max had discovered was about to shatter everything Sarah thought she knew about a case that had been tormenting this town for 4 agonizing months. A case that had consumed the thoughts of thousands of people. A case that had left a family shattered and desperate and clinging to the fading hope that maybe, just maybe, their daughter would come home. The case of Emma Hartley, a 6-year-old girl who had disappeared without a trace on a sunny afternoon in May. A case that was about to be solved by one bark from a dog at a park bench. The first officer arrived in less than 4 minutes. Officer James Rodriguez pulled up in his patrol car, lights flashing, and immediately understood from Sarah's posture and Max's rigid stance that this wasn't a false alarm. Sarah had already cordoned off the immediate area with her body, keeping curious onlookers at a distance, while Max maintained his alert position near the bench. "What do we have?" Rodriguez asked, his hand instinctively moving to his belt as he approached. Max alerted on something beneath the bench. Sarah said, her voice clipped and professional. "He doesn't make mistakes. There's something down there." Rodriguez nodded and immediately called it in. Within minutes, more officers arrived. Then a sergeant. Then a lieutenant. The park, which had been peaceful just moments before, transformed into a controlled chaos of uniforms and protocol and the grim machinery of a police investigation. Sarah watched as they began the careful process of examining the area. Yellow crime scene tape was strung between trees, creating a perimeter. Officers documented the scene with photographs and measurements. Everything had to be done by the book. Everything had to be preserved for evidence. The crowd of onlookers grew. People who had been jogging or walking their dogs or simply enjoying the afternoon stopped to stare. They sensed that something significant was happening. Something dark. Something that would change the narrative of their peaceful park forever. Sarah kept Max close, her hand on his collar, feeling the subtle tremor of his muscles still taut with the knowledge that he'd done his job correctly. The lieutenant in charge was a woman named Rebecca Torres, a veteran investigator with sharp eyes and a methodical approach. She directed the officers with precision, making sure nothing was contaminated, nothing was missed. Careful with that, Torres instructed as officers began to examine what was beneath the bench. Layer by layer, document everything. Layer by layer, they revealed what Max had found. First, dark fabric, a tarp perhaps, or a blanket, something that had been used to cover something else. Sarah's stomach tightened. She'd seen enough crime scenes to know that when something was covered, it was because someone wanted to hide it. The officers pulled back the fabric with gloved hands, moving with the reverence that comes from knowing you might be handling the remains of a human being. Beneath the fabric was something pale. Very pale. Too pale to be anything but what Sarah's mind was already screaming it was. A small hand. Tiny fingers curled in a position that suggested the body had been there for months, decomposing in the autumn heat and humidity. The realization dawned on everyone's face simultaneously. This wasn't a missing person case anymore. This was a homicide investigation. This was a body that had been hidden beneath a park bench for months. They pulled out a small pink backpack. Sarah's breath caught. She'd seen photographs of that backpack. She'd studied missing person posters with that exact backpack displayed prominently. A denim jacket with embroidered flowers. Blue and purple flowers stitched carefully by small hands or a loving parent. Sarah had seen that jacket before too, in the photographs that had been circulated when Emma Hartley disappeared. And inside the tarp, wrapped carefully as if someone had taken great care in the disposal, were the remains of a child. The skeletal structure was small. Too small. The kind of small that could only belong to a 6-year-old girl. Emma Hartley. After 4 months of searching, after 4 months of hope and desperation and the agonizing uncertainty that comes with a missing child, Emma Hartley had been found. But she hadn't been found alive. Lieutenant Torres closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the weight of what they'd discovered. When she opened them again, her expression had hardened into the focused determination of a law enforcement officer who now had a murder to solve. "Get the medical examiner here," she said quietly. "And someone needs to contact the family. They need to hear this from us, not from the news." Sarah felt her throat tighten. She'd delivered bad news before. She'd stood in living rooms and watched families collapse under the weight of information that would destroy them forever. But this was different. This was a child. This was a family that had spent 4 months hoping against hope that Emma would walk through the door. Now they would learn that their daughter was never coming home. Not alive. Not in any way that mattered. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. What had been a beautiful September afternoon had transformed into something else entirely. The park felt different now. Darker, tainted by the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath one of its benches. Sarah looked down at Max, at the dog who had changed everything with one single bark. Good boy, she whispered, running her hand along his head. You did good. Max's tail wagged slightly, but his eyes remained focused, alert, understanding in some deep way that the work wasn't finished. The discovery was only the beginning. The real investigation, the hunt for the person who had done this to a 6-year-old girl, was just starting. And what they were about to uncover would prove that Emma Hartley's death was far from an isolated incident. The call came to the Hartley household at 4:47 p.m. on that Tuesday afternoon. Michael Hartley was in the backyard, attempting to fix the fence that had been broken since July. He wasn't really focused on the fence. He rarely was anymore. He was just moving through the motions of living, going through the routines that kept him from thinking too hard about the empty bedroom upstairs, the toys that hadn't been played with in 4 months, the small pink sneakers that still sat by the front door. His wife, Catherine, was inside. She was always inside now. She'd taken a leave of absence from her job as a nurse 3 days after Emma disappeared. She couldn't focus on other people's emergencies when her own world had collapsed so completely. When the phone rang, Catherine answered it on the second ring. Michael heard her voice from outside, muffled through the kitchen window. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the change in her tone, the way it shifted from the flat, emotionless voice she'd been using for the past 4 months to something else entirely. Something that sounded like fear. Michael dropped his tools and went inside. Catherine was standing in the kitchen. The phone pressed to her ear, her face draining of color. Detective Sarah Chen was on the other end of the line, her voice careful and professional, delivering words that would shatter what remained of their world. "We've found remains," Sarah was saying. "We believe they match the description of your daughter. I'm so very sorry. We need you to come to the station to help us with identification." Catherine's knees buckled. Michael caught her before she fell, the phone slipping from her hand and clattering onto the tile floor. They didn't need to go to the station. They didn't need to identify anything. Deep down, in the place where parents know things about their children that can't be explained by logic or reason, they already knew. Emma was gone. The hope that had sustained them for 4 months. The fragile, desperate hope that maybe she was alive somewhere. That maybe she'd been taken by someone who would eventually bring her back. That maybe this nightmare would end with Emma running through the door and into their arms. That hope died in that moment. What replaced it was something darker, something heavier, something that would define the rest of their lives. Back at the station, Detective Sarah Chen was beginning the process of turning a discovery into an investigation. The medical examiner had confirmed what everyone already knew. The remains were consistent with a 6-year-old female child. The clothing matched the descriptions provided by the Hartley family. The small pink backpack contained items that Emma had been carrying the day she disappeared. A juice box, a half-eaten granola bar, a small notebook with drawings of flowers and hearts. The cause of death would require further examination, but there was evidence of trauma to the skull. Emma Hartley hadn't simply wandered off and gotten lost. She hadn't been taken by someone who intended to keep her alive. Emma Hartley had been murdered. Lieutenant Torres assembled her team in the conference room. Detectives, officers, forensic specialists. The full machinery of a homicide investigation was now in motion. 4 months, Torres said, standing at the head of the table. Emma Hartley disappeared on May 15th. She was last seen leaving her school at approximately 3:15 p.m. She was supposed to go to her grandmother's house. She never arrived. For 4 months we've been searching, 4 months of interviews, door-to-door canvassing, following leads that went nowhere. She pulled up a photograph of Emma on the screen. A 6-year-old girl with blonde pigtails and a gap-toothed smile. The kind of smile that belonged to a child who hadn't yet learned that the world could be cruel. "Now we know where she's been," Torres continued. "Beneath a park bench at Riverside Park, less than 2 miles from her school. Hidden for 4 months while her family suffered. While this community suffered." Sarah sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. She was thinking about the Hartleys, about the moment when their fragile hope had been destroyed. She was thinking about the fact that Emma's body had been just 2 miles away the entire time. That she could have been found weeks ago if Max had alerted on that bench at any point before today. "The question now," Torres said, "is who did this and why?" The investigation that would consume the next weeks and months of their lives was beginning. The news broke at 6 p.m. The local news stations interrupted their regular programming. "Missing girl found dead at Riverside Park," the headline screamed. Within hours, national news outlets picked up the story. A 6-year-old girl, 4 months missing, found by a police dog beneath a park bench. The public's reaction was immediate and visceral. Shock, anger, the kind of outrage that comes when a child's life is taken. Social media exploded with theories and accusations. People demanded answers. People demanded justice. The police department's phone lines were flooded with tips. Most of them would lead nowhere. Some of them would be from people who genuinely thought they had information. Many would be from people who simply wanted to be part of something significant. But buried within those hundreds of calls would be pieces of the puzzle. Fragments of information that, when assembled correctly, would point toward the person responsible. The investigation had begun in earnest. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment with Max curled up on the couch beside her. She ran her hand along his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "You did it," she whispered. "You brought her home." Max's tail wagged slightly, and he rested his head on her lap. But Sarah knew that bringing Emma home was only the beginning. The real work, the work of finding the person who had taken her life, was just starting. And what they were about to discover would prove that Emma Hartley's death was connected to something far darker and more sinister than anyone had imagined. The breakthrough came 3 days later. Detective Sarah Chen was reviewing missing person cases from the past 5 years when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, the kind of thing that could be dismissed as coincidence if you weren't looking for it. But Sarah was looking for it now. She pulled up the files on her computer screen, cross-referencing dates, locations, and circumstances. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with increasing urgency as the pattern became clearer and clearer. 5 missing children in the past 3 years. All between the ages of 5 and 8, all from the same school district. All reported missing during the afternoon hours, between 3 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. All found within a 2-mile radius of Riverside Park. The cases had been handled separately. Different detectives, different investigations, different conclusions. Some had been ruled accidental deaths. Some had been classified as unsolved. One had been closed with minimal investigation when the child's remains were found in a wooded area and attributed to exposure and animal predation. But now, looking at them together, Sarah could see the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. This wasn't a series of isolated incidents. This was a predator, someone who had been hunting children in this community for 3 years. Someone who had killed at least 5 children that they knew of. Someone who had been careful enough, smart enough, to avoid detection for all this time. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up her phone and called Lieutenant Torres. "We need to meet," she said. "I think I've found something." The conference room fell silent as Sarah presented her findings. She'd created a timeline on the whiteboard, mapping out each disappearance and discovery. She'd color-coded the cases: red for confirmed homicides, yellow for suspicious deaths, blue for cases that had been closed without proper investigation. The pattern was undeniable. "This is a serial killer," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the horror of what she was saying. "We have 5 confirmed victims over the past 3 years. All children, all from the same area, all killed and disposed of in similar ways." Lieutenant Torres studied the board, her jaw clenched. The other detectives in the room exchanged looks of shock and grim realization. "Why wasn't this connected before?" asked Detective Marcus Webb, a veteran investigator with 20 years on the force. "Because they were handled by different departments," Sarah explained. The first case, a boy named Tyler Morrison, was found in the woods in 2022. It was attributed to accidental death. He'd wandered off, gotten lost, died of exposure. The investigation was minimal. No reason to suspect foul play. She pointed to the next case on the board. The second case, a girl named Sophie Chen, no relation to me, disappeared in 2023. Her remains were found 3 weeks later, partially decomposed. The autopsy was inconclusive. Without clear evidence of trauma, it was filed as a cold case. Sarah moved to the third case. The third victim, a boy named David Martinez, disappeared in early 2024. His remains were found in a ravine. Again, the investigation was limited. The assumption was that he'd fallen. She pointed to the fourth case. The fourth victim, a girl named Lily Anderson, disappeared just 6 weeks ago. Her body was found in a drainage culvert. The medical examiner noted signs of trauma, but the investigation stalled. There were no leads, no suspects, no clear motive. Finally, she pointed to Emma Hartley's case. And now Emma, the fifth victim, the one that finally brought this into the light. The room was completely silent. The weight of what they were looking at. 5 dead children, a killer who had been operating for 3 years, a community that had no idea they were living alongside a predator, pressed down on everyone present. "We need to go back through all of these cases," Torres said, her voice hard. "We need to look for connections, witnesses, suspects, anyone who appeared in multiple investigations, anyone who had access to all these children." "There's something else," Sarah said quietly. She pulled up another file on her computer, projecting it onto the screen. "I've been looking at the locations where the bodies were found. They're not random. They're all within a specific area, roughly a 2-mile radius of Riverside Park. But more than that, they're all along a specific route." She traced a line on the map displayed on the screen, connecting the 5 discovery locations. "This route," she continued, "goes past the elementary school. It goes through residential neighborhoods. It goes past several parks and recreational areas. It's a route that someone who knew this community well might use regularly. Someone who spent time in these areas. Someone who had access to children." Detective Webb leaned forward, studying the map intently. "A teacher," he said. "Or someone who worked at the school, someone with access to the children." "Or a parent," another detective suggested. "Someone who picked up children regularly." "Or someone who lived in the area," Sarah added. "Someone who knew the neighborhoods well enough to know where to hide bodies, where to avoid detection." Torres stood up, her mind already moving through the next steps. "I want every person who's been interviewed in connection with any of these cases pulled and reviewed. I want a list of anyone who appeared in multiple investigations. I want to know who has access to children in this community. Teachers, coaches, counselors, bus drivers, anyone." She looked directly at Sarah. "And I want you to lead this investigation. You found the pattern. You understand how these cases connect. You're going to find who did this." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. 5 dead children, 5 families, destroyed. And somewhere out there, a killer was walking free, possibly planning his next victim. The clock was ticking. That night, Sarah sat in the police station's records room, surrounded by case files. She'd been there for 8 hours, reading through interview transcripts, studying photographs, looking for the face that appeared in more than one investigation. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, his eyes tracking her movements as she worked. The files told the stories of 5 children. Tyler Morrison, who had loved dinosaurs and wanted to be a paleontologist. Sophie Chen, who was a talented artist and dreamed of becoming a fashion designer. David Martinez, who played soccer and had a laugh that his mother said could light up a room. Lily Anderson, who loved to read and had already gone through the entire children's section of the local library. Emma Hartley, who had pigtails and a gap-toothed smile and dreams of becoming a teacher. All of them were gone. All of them had been taken by someone. Someone who was still out there. Sarah pulled out her notebook and began writing. Names of people who had been interviewed, teachers from the school, parents who had been questioned, neighbors who had provided statements, anyone who had appeared in more than one investigation. By the time the sun came up on Wednesday morning, Sarah had a list of 37 names. One of them, she was certain, was a killer. The morning briefing on Wednesday was tense with purpose. Lieutenant Torres had assembled the full task force in the main conference room. Detectives, forensic specialists, crime scene analysts, and uniformed officers filled every available seat. The energy in the room was electric. A combination of determination and the grim realization that they were hunting a serial killer who had operated undetected for 3 years. Sarah stood at the front of the room, a stack of case files in her hands. She'd spent the entire night reviewing the investigations, cross-referencing interviews, looking for the thread that would connect everything together. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, but her mind was sharp, focused on the task ahead. She'd consumed nearly a full pot of coffee, and her hands trembled slightly with caffeine and adrenaline as she prepared to present her findings. 5 children, Sarah began, projecting the first image onto the screen. 5 families destroyed. 5 cases that should have been connected years ago, but weren't. She clicked through photographs of each victim. 5 smiling faces. 5 children whose lives had been cut short by someone's cruelty. The photographs were the kind that parents treasure. School pictures, birthday moments, candid shots of children enjoying life without knowing that their time was limited. Tyler Morrison, age 7, disappeared May 3rd, 2022. Sarah continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. Found 2 weeks later in a wooded area near Riverside Park. Initial investigation concluded accidental death. He'd wandered off, gotten lost, died of exposure. The autopsy was performed by the county medical examiner at the time, Dr. Harold Finch. The conclusion was that there was no evidence of foul play. She paused, letting that sink in. The detectives in the room were leaning forward, their attention fully focused on her presentation. But when I reviewed the autopsy report this morning, I noticed something that had been overlooked, Sarah said, pulling up the autopsy photographs on the screen. There were defensive wounds on Tyler's hands, small lacerations on his palms and fingers, the kind of wounds you get when you're struggling against someone. the kind of wounds that suggest a child was fighting for his life. These wounds were documented in the autopsy report, but Dr. Finch attributed them to post-mortem animal predation. However, when I consulted with a forensic pathologist this morning, she indicated that the pattern and depth of these wounds are inconsistent with animal predation. They're consistent with a child struggling against an adult. Detective Webb, who had been with the department for nearly 2 decades, sat back in his chair, his expression hardening. "You're saying the autopsy was misinterpreted?" he asked. "I'm saying it's possible," Sarah replied carefully. "Or it's possible that Dr. Finch simply didn't look closely enough. Either way, we need to have these cases reviewed by an independent examiner." She moved to the next case, clicking to a new set of photographs. Sophie Chen, age 6, disappeared August 17, 2023, Sarah said. Found 3 weeks later, partially decomposed in a wooded area approximately 1.3 miles from Riverside Park. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Finch again. The conclusion was that the remains were too decomposed to determine cause of death with certainty. The case was filed as unsolved and eventually went cold. Sarah pulled up the autopsy photographs, which showed skeletal remains and fragments of clothing. "But there are fractures in the skull," Sarah pointed out, using a laser pointer to highlight the damaged areas. "Multiple fractures, the kind that could be consistent with blunt force trauma. The kind that could indicate the child was struck repeatedly with a heavy object." Dr. Finch noted these fractures in his report, but concluded they could have been caused post-mortem by animal predation or environmental factors such as rocks falling on the remains or decomposition processes. She looked directly at Lieutenant Torres. "I think Dr. Finch was wrong, or I think he wasn't looking carefully enough, or I think something else was happening, something that caused him to miss, or perhaps overlook, the evidence of violence." Detective Marcus Webb, a veteran investigator with 20 years on the force and a reputation for meticulous work, sat forward in his chair. "You think the medical examiner missed something or covered something up?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of the implications. "I think we need to have all 5 autopsies reviewed by an independent medical examiner," Sarah said firmly. "Someone who isn't part of the original investigation. Someone who can look at these cases with fresh eyes and without any preconceived notions about what they should find." She pulled up a photograph of a woman in her 60s with sharp features and intelligent eyes. "I want to request Dr. Patricia Summers from the State Medical Examiner's Office," Sarah continued. "She's thorough. She has extensive experience with pediatric homicides, and she doesn't miss anything. She's also known for being completely objective and willing to challenge previous findings if the evidence warrants it." Torres nodded immediately, her jaw set with determination. "Make it happen. Get Dr. Summers involved today if possible. Tell her this is a priority case. We need those reviews expedited." Sarah continued with the timeline, clicking to the next case file. "David Martinez, age 8, disappeared February 12, 2024, Sarah said. Found in a ravine 3 days later, approximately 2.1 miles from Riverside Park. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Finch. Conclusion: accidental death. The child had fallen from a cliff while exploring. The investigation was minimal. Officers assumed that a child had simply wandered into a dangerous area and met with a tragic accident. She pulled up photographs of the ravine where David's body had been found. But when I looked at the autopsy photographs and the crime scene images, I noticed something, Sarah said. The injuries on the body are consistent with blunt force trauma, not with a fall from a significant height. A fall from a cliff would result in different types of injuries. Fractures consistent with impact from a height with the most severe injuries typically on the side of the body that made contact first. These injuries look more like someone beat this child repeatedly with a blunt object. The trauma is distributed across multiple areas of the body in a pattern consistent with manual assault rather than a fall. She paused, studying the faces of the detectives in the room. Several of them were taking notes, their expressions growing darker as the implications became clearer. Lily Anderson, age 7, disappeared June 8, 2024. Sarah continued. Found in a drainage culvert 2 days later, approximately 1.8 miles from Riverside Park. The autopsy was performed by Dr. Finch. This time, the conclusion was that there was evidence of trauma, but the investigation stalled because there were no clear leads, no suspects, no motive that made sense. She pulled up the final set of autopsy photographs. And then Emma Hartley, age 6, disappeared May 15, 2024. Found by Max beneath a park bench at Riverside Park just 3 days ago. The autopsy is pending, but we already know there's evidence of trauma to the skull. The preliminary examination suggests blunt force trauma consistent with repeated impacts. Sarah paused, letting the weight of what she was saying settle over the room. 5 dead children. 5 cases that had been mishandled or overlooked. 5 families that had been denied justice. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed map of the city with all 5 discovery locations marked with red circles and connected by lines. Here's what I found when I analyzed the geographic data, Sarah said, tracing the route with her finger. All 5 bodies were found within a 2-mile radius of Riverside Park. All 5 children attended the same elementary school, Riverside Elementary. All 5 disappeared during the afternoon hours, between 3 p.m. and 4:30 p.m., which is the time when children are typically walking home from school or being picked up by family members. All 5 were found within 2 weeks of disappearing, suggesting that the killer disposed of the bodies relatively quickly after the murders. She zoomed in on the map, showing the specific locations more clearly. But there's more, Sarah continued. Look at the pattern of the discoveries. They form a rough circuit around the park, a circuit that someone who knew this area well could traverse without drawing much attention. A circuit that connects the school to the park through residential neighborhoods, along walking paths, and through wooded areas where a person could move relatively unobserved. Detective Marcus Webb stood up, studying the map more carefully. He walked to the front of the room and traced the route with his finger, his mind clearly working through the implications. The route, he said slowly. It's like a circuit. Someone who knew this area well could move through it without being noticed. Someone who had a reason to be in all these locations. Someone who understood the patterns of the community. Exactly, Sarah said, nodding. Which is why I've compiled a comprehensive list of everyone who appeared in more than one investigation. Everyone who had access to these children. Everyone who had reason to be in these areas on multiple occasions. She pulled up another list on the screen. 37 names, each one highlighted with detailed notes about their connection to the cases, their proximity to the discovery locations, and any relevant background information. Teachers from Riverside Elementary, Sarah explained, pointing to the first group of names. Parents who picked up children from the school. Bus drivers, coaches, counselors, maintenance workers, janitors, shop owners in the area. Neighbors who lived near the park. Anyone who could have had access to these children. Anyone who could have known their routines. Anyone who could have identified them as vulnerable targets. She scrolled through the list, highlighting specific names. I've already begun preliminary background checks on all 37 individuals, Sarah continued. I've looked for criminal histories, complaints, anything that might indicate a propensity for violence or inappropriate behavior toward children. Several names have already flagged as requiring deeper investigation. Lieutenant Torres studied the list, her eyes moving from name to name with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey. "We start with interviews," she said decisively. "We pull in everyone on this list. We ask them about their whereabouts on the dates these children disappeared. We look for inconsistencies. We look for anyone who acts nervous, anyone who has something to hide. We look for anyone who doesn't have solid alibis for all 5 dates." She looked at Sarah with an expression of grim determination. "And we get those autopsies reviewed immediately. If Dr. Finch missed something, or if he deliberately misinterpreted the evidence, we need to know. We need to understand why 5 obvious homicides were classified as accidents or unsolved deaths. We need to understand if there was negligence, incompetence, or something more sinister involved." The interviews began that afternoon. Sarah sat across from the first person on her list, Mr. Robert Caldwell, a substitute teacher at Riverside Elementary who had been interviewed in connection with Tyler Morrison's disappearance in 2022. He'd been questioned because he'd been at the school the day Tyler disappeared. He'd been cleared at the time because he had an alibi. He'd been in the school office filing paperwork when Tyler left for the day. But Sarah noticed something in the interview transcript that had been missed before. Something that had been buried in the details of the original investigation. Mr. Caldwell had mentioned that he often took walks through Riverside Park after school. He said he liked to exercise. He said he needed to clear his head after dealing with difficult students. He said the park was peaceful and helped him decompress from the stress of the job. Riverside Park, the location where all 5 bodies had been found. The location that appeared in all 5 cases. "Mr. Caldwell," Sarah said, leaning forward across the metal table in the interview room. Her voice was calm and professional, but her eyes were sharp, watching his every reaction. "I'd like to ask you some questions about your activities on specific dates. Some follow-up questions to the interview you gave back in 2022. Caldwell shifted in his seat uncomfortably. He was a thin man in his early 50s, with graying hair that was slightly unkempt and nervous eyes that darted around the room, unable to settle on any one point. He wore a cardigan sweater despite the warm weather outside, and his hands fidgeted constantly with the zipper, pulling it up and down in a repetitive motion that suggested anxiety. "I already answered questions about this," he said, his voice slightly defensive. "Years ago, I was cleared. You people said I didn't have anything to do with that boy's disappearance." "I understand," Sarah said calmly, her tone reasonable and non-accusatory. "But we're re-examining all the cases related to missing children in this area. We want to make sure we didn't miss anything. We want to make sure that every lead was fully investigated. So I'd like to go through the dates again, if you don't mind, just to clarify a few things." She pulled out a calendar and placed it on the table between them, pointing to the specific dates. On May 3rd, 2022, when Tyler Morrison disappeared, where were you between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m.? Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notebook, ready to write down his response. Caldwell's eyes shifted away from her gaze. He looked at the calendar, then at his hands, then at the wall behind Sarah, anywhere but directly at her. I don't remember," he said slowly. "That was 2 years ago. I don't keep track of where I am every single day." "You don't remember where you were on the day a child from your school went missing?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice neutral and non-judgmental, though her internal alarms were beginning to sound. "That's a pretty significant day. It would have been in the news. The school would have been in chaos. You would have been questioned by police." I was probably at home, Caldwell said, his voice becoming more uncertain. Or at the park. I often went to the park. I've already told you that. Sarah made a detailed note, underlining the response. And on August 17th, 2023, when Sophie Chen disappeared? She asked, moving to the next date. Where were you between 3 WASC p.m. and 5 GAD p.m. on that day? Caldwell's leg began bouncing under the table in a rapid, repetitive motion. His hands gripped the edge of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Beads of perspiration began to form on his forehead, despite the cool temperature of the interview room. I don't know, he said, his voice rising slightly in pitch, betraying his anxiety. That was over a year ago. I'd have to check my calendar or my work schedule or something. You don't have a calendar from 2023? Sarah asked, her tone suggesting mild surprise. Most people keep some kind of record of their activities. A work schedule, a calendar, a journal, something. I don't keep detailed records of where I go every day, Caldwell said, his voice becoming more agitated. I'm a substitute teacher. I don't have a fixed schedule. My hours change constantly depending on which teachers are out sick or on vacation. I could have been anywhere. I could have been at home. I could have been at the park. I could have been at the grocery store. I don't remember. Sarah studied him carefully, noting every sign of stress and anxiety. His nervousness could be innocent. Many people became nervous when questioned by police, even if they had nothing to hide. Innocent people often became flustered and confused when asked to recall events from years ago. But there was something about the way he was avoiding eye contact, the way his leg was bouncing in that rapid, repetitive motion, the way his hands were gripping the chair so tightly his knuckles were white, the way sweat was beading on his forehead. There was something there, something that went beyond normal nervousness. Mr. Caldwell, have you ever been to Riverside Park? Sarah asked, shifting her approach slightly. I'm asking because we're trying to understand the movements of various people in the community. Yes, of course, he said quickly. I told you, I like to walk there. I've already told you that. How often would you say you go to Riverside Park? Sarah asked, pulling out a small notebook and beginning to write. On average, how many times per week? Caldwell hesitated, clearly trying to calculate an answer that would seem reasonable, but not suspicious. I don't know. A few times a week, maybe, he said finally. 3 or 4 times, maybe. I'm not sure. It depends on the weather and my schedule. 3 or 4 times a week, Sarah repeated, making a note. That's quite frequent. What do you do when you're at the park? I walk, Caldwell said. I exercise. I sit on benches and read. I like to be outside. The park is peaceful. And during these visits to the park, Sarah continued, did you ever see any of these children? She pulled out photographs of the 5 victims and spread them on the table in front of him. Tyler Morrison, Sophie Chen, David Martinez, Lily Anderson, Emma Hartley. Caldwell stared at the photographs for a long moment. His face had gone pale, almost ashen. His hands were shaking visibly. He reached out as if to touch one of the photographs, then pulled his hand back. No, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I never saw them. But his hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold them still. After Caldwell left the interview room, Sarah sat with Lieutenant Torres in the observation room, watching the recording of the interview on the monitor. They'd been recording the entire conversation, and now they reviewed the footage, watching Caldwell's body language, his facial expressions, his every reaction. He's nervous, Torres said, her arms crossed over her chest. very nervous. But nervous doesn't mean guilty. We need more than this. No, Sarah agreed. But it means we need to look deeper. I want his alibi for all 5 dates verified independently. I want to know everywhere he's been, everywhere he's worked, everywhere he's claimed to be. I want to know if he has a criminal history, if there are any complaints against him, anything that might indicate a pattern of inappropriate behavior. She pulled up Caldwell's file on her computer, accessing the police database and running a comprehensive background check. What she found made her blood run cold. In 2015, Robert Caldwell had been arrested for indecent exposure in a park. The charges had been dropped when the witness didn't show up to testify. The incident report indicated that Caldwell had been observed exposing himself to a group of children on a playground. When confronted by a parent, he had claimed it was an accident, that he hadn't realized children were present. In 2018, there had been a complaint from a parent at a school where he was working as a substitute teacher. The complaint alleged that Caldwell had touched a child inappropriately, placing his hand on the child's leg in a way that made the child uncomfortable. The investigation had been inconclusive. The child was too young to provide a clear statement about what had happened, and Caldwell had denied any wrongdoing. The school had allowed him to resign without further action, and the case had been closed. And in 2021, just 1 year before Tyler Morrison disappeared, Caldwell had been arrested again for loitering in a park near a children's playground. He'd been observed watching children play, and when approached by a police officer, he'd been unable to provide a clear reason for why he was there. He'd claimed he was simply enjoying the weather. He'd been released with a warning, and no charges had been filed. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she reviewed the information. "We need to bring him back in," she said, her voice tight with controlled intensity. "We need to search his home, his car, everything. We need to find evidence that connects him to these murders." Torres was already on her phone, calling for a search warrant. Her voice was clipped and authoritative as she explained the situation to the judge on the other end of the line. She cited Caldwell's previous arrests, his access to children, his nervousness during the interview, and the pattern of his presence in areas where the victims had been found. The judge, hearing the urgency in her voice and understanding the gravity of the situation, approved the search warrant within 30 minutes. The search of Robert Caldwell's home took place early the following morning. Sarah stood outside his small, nondescript house on Maple Street, a street that was, coincidentally, only 3 blocks from Riverside Park and directly along the route that connected the school to the park. The house was a modest, single-story structure with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. It looked like the kind of place where someone lived alone, where no one paid much attention to what happened behind closed doors. Officers in protective gear moved through the rooms, cataloging everything they found. They photographed the interior, documented the layout, and began the systematic process of searching for evidence. In the basement, they discovered a locked metal box hidden behind a loose panel in the wall. Inside the box were photographs. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. Photographs of children. Some of the photographs were of children from the school, taken in the hallways or in classrooms. Some were of children in the park, taken from a distance without their knowledge. Some were of children at the local swimming pool, captured through a fence. Some were of children at various locations around the community. And among those photographs were images of all 5 victims. Sarah felt her stomach turn as she looked at the photographs. Each one was dated in Caldwell's handwriting. Each one showed a child who didn't know they were being photographed. Each one documented the predator's obsession, his careful study of his victims, his selection process. The photographs showed the victims in various locations, walking to school, playing in the park, waiting at bus stops, sitting in classrooms. The photographs documented their routines, their patterns, their vulnerabilities. They showed Caldwell's meticulous planning, his careful observation, his identification of targets. In a drawer in Caldwell's bedroom, they found journals, handwritten entries documenting his thoughts, his desires, his fantasies, his plans. The writing was obsessive, repetitive, deeply disturbing. The journals documented years of fantasies about children. They documented the planning of abductions. They documented the murders in explicit, horrifying detail. Sarah read through the entries, her jaw clenched, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and revulsion. The entries described Caldwell's attraction to children, his resentment of adults who protected them, his fantasies about taking them, harming them, controlling them. The entries documented his selection of each victim, his observation of their routines, his planning of the abductions. And the entries documented the murders themselves. In clinical, detached language, Caldwell had written about how he had lured each child, how he had taken them to secluded locations, how he had killed them, how he had hidden their bodies, how he had felt in the aftermath, a mixture of satisfaction and regret, of power and shame. In the garage, hidden behind a false wall that the officers discovered through careful examination of the structure, they found additional items. Clothing belonging to the victims, a small pink hair ribbon that matched the one Emma Hartley had been wearing in her school photograph, a shoe that matched the size and style worn by Sophie Chen, a piece of a shirt with a specific pattern that matched clothing worn by David Martinez, a necklace that had belonged to Lily Anderson, trophies, evidence of the murders, physical proof of Caldwell's crimes. And in a locked filing cabinet in the garage, they found maps. Detailed maps of the area around Riverside Park with routes marked in red. Routes that connected the school to the park. Routes that showed where children could be intercepted, where they could be taken without being seen. Routes that showed alternative paths through wooded areas and residential neighborhoods. Routes that showed where bodies could be hidden. Robert Caldwell had planned everything meticulously. He had studied the patterns of the children. He had learned their routines. He had identified the vulnerable ones, the ones who walked home alone, the ones who didn't have adults watching them closely enough, the ones who trusted too easily, the ones who were small enough that he could overpower them. And then he had taken them. When Caldwell was brought back in for questioning the following day, he was confronted with the evidence. Sarah sat across from him in the interview room, and she methodically presented each piece of evidence: the photographs, the journals, the trophies, the maps. Caldwell initially denied everything. He claimed the photographs were coincidence. He claimed the journals were fiction, the product of a disturbed imagination, but not actual documentation of real events. He claimed the clothing had been planted by police. He claimed the maps were just his way of planning hiking routes. But as Sarah presented the evidence piece by piece, as she showed him the photographs of each victim and the corresponding journal entries documenting their murders, as she confronted him with the physical evidence of his crimes, something broke inside him. He confessed to all 5 murders. He described in detail how he had lured each child, how he had offered them rides, offered them candy, offered them help finding lost pets, how he had taken them to secluded locations, abandoned buildings, wooded areas, drainage culverts, places where no one would hear their screams, how he had killed them, how he had struck them with a heavy object, a metal pipe he'd kept in his garage, how he had strangled them, how he had watched the light fade from their eyes, how he had hidden their bodies, how he had wrapped them in tarps and blankets, how he had left them in ravines and drainage culverts and beneath park benches, places where he knew they would eventually be found, but where he could control the timing. How he had kept trophies of his crimes, how he had photographed the bodies before disposing of them, how he had kept the journals documenting every detail of his crimes. The confession was recorded, every word documented, every admission of guilt captured on video and audio. Every detail of the murders, every expression of remorse mixed with satisfaction, every revelation of the predator's mind laid bare. 5 dead children, 5 families that would finally have answers, 5 cases that would finally be closed. The trial of Robert Caldwell began on a cold Monday morning in March, nearly 9 months after his arrest. The courthouse was packed with media representatives, curious onlookers, and the families of the victims. Security was tight. Officers stood at every entrance. Metal detectors screened everyone who entered, and plainclothes detectives moved through the crowds, watching for any sign of trouble. Sarah sat in the gallery behind the prosecution table, her presence a silent witness to the proceedings. Max was at home, cared for by a neighbor, but she thought of him often during the trial. It was Max who had started all of this. Max, whose keen nose had discovered Emma Hartley beneath that park bench and set in motion the chain of events that had led to the capture of a serial killer. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. The assistant district attorney, a woman named Jennifer Martinez, no relation to David Martinez, one of the victims, presented the evidence with clinical precision. The photographs were displayed on large screens for the jury to see. The journals were read aloud, their horrifying contents filling the courtroom with a palpable sense of dread. The physical evidence was presented by forensic specialists who explained the significance of each item, how each piece of clothing, each trophy, each map connected Caldwell to the crimes. Dr. Patricia Summers, the independent medical examiner Sarah had requested, testified about the autopsies. She explained how the original examinations had missed or misinterpreted crucial evidence. She described the defensive wounds on Tyler Morrison's hands, the fractures on Sophie Chen's skull, the blunt, forced trauma on David Martinez's body, the signs of strangulation on Lily Anderson's remains, and the trauma to Emma Hartley's skull. These are not accidental deaths, Dr. Summers testified, her voice steady and authoritative. These are homicides. The evidence is clear once you know what to look for. The original examinations were incomplete, and the conclusions drawn were inconsistent with the physical evidence present in the bodies. The defense attorney, a man named Gerald Finch, no relation to the medical examiner, attempted to create reasonable doubt. He argued that Caldwell's confession had been coerced, that the evidence had been planted, that the photographs could have been taken innocently. But the evidence was overwhelming, and his arguments fell flat in the face of the physical proof and Caldwell's own detailed confession. Caldwell took the stand in his own defense, a decision that many observers believed was a mistake. Under cross-examination by Jennifer Martinez, he was forced to confront the details of his crimes. He was asked to explain why his fingerprints were on the clothing found in his garage. He was asked to explain why his handwriting matched the writing in the journals. He was asked to explain why the photographs in his collection matched the victims and the locations where they were found. His answers were rambling and contradictory. He claimed he didn't remember writing the journals. He claimed he didn't know how the victim's clothing had gotten into his garage. He claimed the photographs were taken innocently, that he was simply documenting his walks in the park. But his testimony only reinforced the prosecution's case. His demeanor on the stand, nervous, evasive, sometimes angry, suggested a man who was hiding something, a man who was guilty. The jury deliberated for only 3 days before returning with a verdict. Guilty on all counts, the foreman announced, his voice carrying the weight of the decision. Guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. Some people cried. Some people applauded. The families of the victims sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of relief and continued grief. No verdict could bring their children back. No sentence could undo the damage that had been done. Caldwell showed no emotion as the verdict was read. He stared straight ahead, his face blank, his eyes empty. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. The families of the victims were given the opportunity to address the court. Michael and Catherine Hartley spoke about Emma, about the light she brought to their lives, about the future that had been stolen from her. They spoke about the pain of losing a child, about the way that pain never truly went away, about the way it colored every moment of their lives. Emma wanted to be a teacher, Catherine said, her voice breaking. She wanted to help children learn and grow. She wanted to make a difference in the world. Robert Caldwell took that from her. He took her future, her potential, her life. And he took something from us as well. He took our daughter, our joy, our hope for the future. The other families spoke as well. They talked about their children, about Tyler's love of dinosaurs, about Sophie's artistic talent, about David's infectious laugh, about Lily's love of reading. They talked about the children these victims could have become, the contributions they could have made to the world. And they all spoke about the pain of losing a child to violence, about the way that pain never healed, about the way it defined the rest of their lives. Judge Harold Chen, a distant relative of Sophie Chen's family, listened to every word. When the families had finished speaking, he turned to Robert Caldwell. Robert Caldwell, you have been found guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder, the judge said, his voice grave and measured. You have taken the lives of 5 innocent children. You have caused immeasurable pain to their families and to this community. You have shown no remorse for your actions. You have shown no understanding of the gravity of what you have done. The judge paused, looking directly at Caldwell. It is the judgment of this court that you be sentenced to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in prison. May God have mercy on your soul. The courtroom fell silent for a moment, and then the families of the victims began to cry. Some from a sense of justice served, others from the realization that no sentence could truly compensate for their loss. Robert Caldwell was led away by guards, his head down, his body moving mechanically. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, confined to a cell, separated from society, paying for his crimes in the only way the law allowed. In the weeks and months following the trial, the community began the long process of healing. A memorial was erected in Riverside Park, a beautiful stone monument with the names of the 5 victims carved into it. Flowers were left at the memorial regularly. Children from the school visited with their teachers to pay their respects. The community gathered on the anniversary of the murders to remember the victims and to support the families. The school implemented new safety measures. Children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. Parents were required to pick up their children or arrange for supervised transportation. Background checks were conducted on all staff members. Security cameras were installed throughout the school and in the parking areas. The police department conducted an internal investigation into how the original cases had been handled. Dr. Harold Finch, the medical examiner who had misinterpreted or overlooked the evidence in the original autopsies, was forced to retire. An investigation was launched into whether his errors had been the result of negligence or something more sinister, but no criminal charges were filed. It was determined that he had simply not looked carefully enough at the evidence, that he had made assumptions based on incomplete information, that he had failed in his duty to provide thorough and accurate examinations. Sarah was promoted to detective sergeant and became the head of a new task force dedicated to cold cases involving missing children. She was determined to ensure that no other cases would fall through the cracks, that no other predators would operate undetected in the community. 1 year after Caldwell's conviction, Sarah returned to Riverside Park with Max. The park looked the same as it always had. Trees and grass, walking paths and benches, a place where families came to enjoy the outdoors. But it had been transformed in the minds of the community. It was no longer simply a place of recreation. It was a place where tragedy had occurred, where 5 children had been taken, where a predator had hidden the evidence of his crimes. Sarah walked along the path that led to the memorial. Max walked beside her, his leash held loosely in her hand. The dog seemed to sense the significance of the place. He moved more slowly, more deliberately, as if paying his respects. At the memorial, Sarah knelt down and placed her hand on the stone. The names were carved deeply into the surface. Tyler Morrison, Sophie Chen, David Martinez, Lily Anderson, Emma Hartley. 5 names, 5 lives, 5 futures that would never be lived. Max pressed his nose against the stone, as if trying to understand what had happened here, why his human was sad. Sarah ran her hand along the dog's head, feeling the warmth of his fur, the steady beat of his heart. "You brought them home," she whispered. "You gave their families answers. You gave them justice." Max's tail wagged softly, and he leaned against her leg. They stood there for a long time, Sarah and Max, remembering the 5 children who had been taken too soon, honoring their memory, bearing witness to their loss. The impact of the case extended far beyond the community. The media coverage of the trial had brought national attention to the issue of serial killers operating in plain sight, to the failures of law enforcement to connect cases, to the importance of thorough investigations and careful examination of evidence. Criminologists and forensic specialists studied the case, looking for lessons that could be applied to other investigations. Sarah was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the importance of connecting cases, about the value of looking for patterns, about the need to question assumptions and to examine evidence carefully. She became an advocate for improved training in forensic pathology and for greater communication between different law enforcement agencies. The case also sparked a broader conversation about child safety in the community. Schools across the country implemented new safety measures based on the lessons learned from Riverside Elementary. Parents became more vigilant about their children's whereabouts. Communities organized neighborhood watch programs and child safety initiatives. But perhaps the most important impact was on the families of the victims. The Hartleys eventually found a way to move forward, though the pain of losing Emma never truly went away. They established a scholarship in Emma's name for students who wanted to become teachers. They worked with the school to develop a program to help children recognize and report inappropriate behavior by adults. They became advocates for child safety and for the families of other victims of violent crime. The other families did similar things, establishing scholarships, creating awareness programs, working to ensure that their children's deaths would not be meaningless, that something positive could come from their tragedy. 2 years after Caldwell's conviction, Sarah sat in her office at the police station, reviewing a new case file. A missing child. A girl, age 7, who had disappeared from a park in a neighboring county. The initial investigation had concluded that she had simply wandered off, that she would likely be found safe and sound. But Sarah had learned to look deeper. She had learned to question assumptions. She had learned to connect the dots that others might miss. She pulled up the case files from her jurisdiction, comparing the details. She looked at the location, the age of the victim, the circumstances of the disappearance. She looked for patterns, and she found them. There were similarities to the Caldwell cases, not exact matches, but enough to warrant investigation, enough to suggest that there might be another predator operating in the region. Sarah picked up her phone and called the detective in the neighboring county. "I think you might have a problem," she said. "I think you might have a serial killer." The investigation that followed would take months, but it would eventually result in the arrest and conviction of another predator. And it would never have happened if Sarah hadn't learned the lessons of the Caldwell case, if she hadn't understood the importance of connecting cases and looking for patterns. 5 years after Robert Caldwell's arrest, Sarah stood in the Riverside Park Memorial Garden with the families of the victims. It was the anniversary of Emma Hartley's disappearance, and the families had gathered to remember their children. They brought flowers and photographs. They told stories. They cried together. Michael and Catherine Hartley stood at the memorial, their hands clasped together. They had aged in the 5 years since Emma's death, their faces lined with grief and the weight of their loss. But they had found a way to continue living, to honor their daughter's memory, to make meaning from their tragedy. "We miss you, Emma," Catherine said softly, placing a bouquet of flowers at the base of the memorial. "We think about you every day. We wonder what you would be doing now, what you would have become. But we know that you are at peace, and we find comfort in that." The other families shared similar sentiments, each one honoring their lost child in their own way. Sarah stood apart from the families, giving them space to grieve privately. But she was present, bearing witness, remembering the 5 children whose names were carved into the stone. Max stood beside her, his leash held loosely in her hand. The dog seemed to understand the significance of the moment. He was still, quiet, respectful of the grief that surrounded them. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Sarah knelt down and placed her hand on the memorial stone one more time. "Rest well," she whispered. "You are remembered. You are honored. Your deaths were not in vain." And as she stood up and turned to leave, she knew that she would continue to carry the memory of these 5 children with her for the rest of her life. She would continue to work to protect other children, to prevent other tragedies, to ensure that other predators did not operate undetected in the shadows. It was her purpose now. It was what gave her life meaning. Detective Sergeant Sarah Chen sat in her office, reviewing the cold case files that had been assigned to her task force. Over the past 10 years, her work had led to the arrest and conviction of 7 serial killers and numerous other violent offenders. She had become one of the most respected detectives in the state, known for her meticulous attention to detail and her ability to connect cases that others had missed. Max, now in his senior years, rested on a dog bed in the corner of her office. He had been retired from active duty 5 years earlier, but he still came to work with Sarah most days. He was a living reminder of the case that had changed everything. The dog who had found Emma Hartley and set in motion the chain of events that had led to the capture of a serial killer and the prevention of countless future crimes. On the wall of her office, Sarah had hung a photograph of the 5 victims. It was a reminder of why she did this work, a reminder of the lives that had been taken, a reminder of the families that had been destroyed. Below the photograph, she had written a quote. "In memory of Tyler Morrison, Sophie Chen, David Martinez, Lily Anderson, and Emma Hartley. May their lives be remembered, their deaths be honored, and their memory inspire us to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Every detective who worked with Sarah saw that photograph and that quote every time they entered her office. And every detective understood the importance of the work they were doing, the responsibility they carried, the lives that depended on their diligence and their dedication. Sarah had turned the tragedy of 5 murdered children into a force for good, into a mission to protect others, into a legacy that would outlast her own life. And in doing so, she had found a way to give meaning to their deaths, to honor their memory, and to ensure that their lives, though tragically short, had made a difference in the world.